I've been working on an application called Mount Fuji lately, and I thought I'd show it to you. Perhaps you might want to install it and take a look. Now, Mount Fuji is a front end for Hatari. It allows you to edit different configurations for multiple 32-bit Atari machines and execute them easily. Fuji allows you to quickly find and see the configuration of and launch different Hatari systems. Fuji is open sourced under the GPL v3, so feel free to have at it. So why did I start this project? What problem does it solve? Atari is capable of emulating just about the entire line of 32-bit Atari computers, the ST, the TT, the Falcon. And when using Hatari, it's common to have multiple config files for different system configurations. You might have a basic ST configured for playing games. Then again, for productivity apps, you might have a Mega ST, and at the top end, you might have a Falcon. And don't get me started on TTs with a gig of fast RAM and a 68030 running at 32 MHz. Of course, there is a metric crap ton of possible configurations in between. And therein lies the rub. Managing all these configurations is not without its problem. I accrue loads of configs for different setups. Rarely are they well named, and I find myself hunting through them to find out what they are. Or I pick one that's named Gaming ST and find out it's actually being configured as a TT with a monochrome monitor. So to discover what the actual configuration of an emulated system is when you load it in Atari, it involves clicking through the various config sections to see what's what. So Mount Fuji was birthed out of my lack of organisation, and like any problem that a dev has, the solution wasn't get more organised, it was write some code. So Fuji was born and started growing. It's certainly not finished yet, but it's what I would call a minimum viable product. We'll cover the gaps later in this video. So Mount Fuji is implemented in .NET MAUI, a somewhat cross-platform development system. And at the moment I'm targeting Mac OS, which is what I'm going to be demoing, and Windows. As to versions, any version of Mac OS Catalina 10.5 or higher works, and that uses Mac Catalyst, so it should work both Intel and ARM. It supports Windows 10 version 1809 or higher, and that's using WinUI 3. Unfortunately, MAUI does not support Linux currently, so that will remain a future goal. That is if Microsoft ever get their finger out and support it, but I wouldn't hold your breath for now. So this video is going to be in 4 sections. I'm going to show how it works, then we'll talk about gaps and missing features. After that, I'll have a chapter on installation for macOS and a chapter on installation for PC. And that way you can skip the installation instructions for platforms you're not interested in. So here we are on my Mac. I've started Mount Fuji. And if you look at the Getting Started section, it says, click the cog icon above to edit your preferences and set the Hatari application and config file paths. It also says that you can set the default folders for ROMs, floppies, etc. First off, when we are in the dialog, you'll notice that 2 of these are already filled in. Now, there's no magic happening here, no auto detection. These fields are set during installation and vary by platform. So we've already configured them during the installation that you'll see at the end. Now, Atari had an option to specify the default folder where it looks for floppy images. And one thing that really lacks was the ability to set paths for all other items. So I found myself hunting around the file system for different files. So part of the origin story for Fuji was to address that. So here's kind of my setup nowadays. I have a root folder under which I have a folder for cartridges, floppy images. Now this is my GemDOS root folder. I tend to share the same GemDOS root folder across all of my systems. And that's because I mainly use it to store installation files for apps. Then I have a folder for all my TOS ROMs, and then the system folder contains all of the hard drive images for different setups, and the templates folder. Now that just contains some hard drive images that I use to quickly bootstrap new systems. Now while your setup will differ, I imagine it'll be organised in a similar manner. Let's set our ROM folder. Now our cartridge folder. The floppy folder. The hard disk folder. Now in my case that's my systems folder. And finally the GemDOS folder. Remember, these aren't fixed for when you create systems. You'll still be able to navigate. They're just a starting point. Okay, if we close that dialog, we're configured. So the last step in the Getting Started section says, you can create a new system by using the plus button in the header bar above. Let's do that. So up pops the new system dialog. On the left is a set of templates that we'll look at later. They cover common, I guess I might call them retail configurations of STs, TTs and Falcons. I want to create an analog of my real ST. This is the disk image that I use to burn to an SD card for my SD for ST. So I maintain it on the Mac. Let's select our system type is going to be ST because it's an ST. We leave video timing at default. We're not a Falcon, so we're not using a DSP. I don't have a blitter in my ST, and I won't be patching timer D. Now, the little thing about that is like this option lowers the frequency of a timer that TOS uses. And setting this can improve performance on slower computers. That's the Hatari computer, particularly I think it was ST emulation. Now, this isn't a video about advanced Hatari configuration, but that's a subject I want to address eventually. But that type of description of what the option means is something I would like to add to Fuji via tooltips, just to make this more easy to use. I just realised that I spelt real wrong, so let's rename that. CPU wise, everything is stock, so it's a 68,000 at 8 MHz. My physical ST has 4 meg of memory, so let's have that. And for ROMs, I'll go for 1.4, which is what I run. We're not running with a cartridge. We're going to run with a hard disk. So let's select my ST's hard disk image. That's ASCI. And we don't have SCSI, we don't have IDE. So I'm going to set a GemDOS folder to get my install files. And I'm going to make sure we add it after our ASCI hard drive. This is an example of where Fuji could start to diverge from Hatari. For example, by default, Hatari has the option to add your GemDOS drive after as set to false. But we could in this app choose to set it true in our templates, if that's what we want. And I would appreciate any idea you guys have for Fuji as we go through it. And you can head over to the GitHub repo or add comments to the video below. We're not going to use a floppy on this system. We'll do that later when we talk about games. We're going to use mono because I'm a productivity kind of a guy. I'm not using extended resolutions. Now, recently I posted a survey on my community page and asked who uses extended resolutions. And there were, at the time, 19 respondents, and thank you for voting, and 5% or one person said they use them all the time. If that person is watching this video, I'd really appreciate a comment on what your use cases are. What system configuration you use, machine type, memory, TOS version, etc. Perhaps what operating system, just so that can kind of influence the design of this part of the app. So as it stands, I followed a similar way to the Mac UI version of Atari that offers a few pre-canned resolutions and color depths. Let's turn off indicators. I don't want a status bar. And that's another instance of a setting that we can choose what the default should be. Or perhaps we decide these things via a survey on the community tab of my channel. Finally, sound is enabled, playback quality is 44 kHz, and we're using ST-tabled voice mixing. Now I'm going to save and run the system. While it starts up, I just want to really briefly announce what's missing here. Later we'll go into details on gaps. So we have no keyboard section, no joystick sections, and no devices sections yet. As I said, it's a minimal viable product, but for many use cases, it's perfectly usable. So I'm going to fast forward this till we get onto the desktop, and we should have a drive in E, which is our GemDOS folder that we mounted. Right, so that's our first system out of the way. Let's pretend we're rich and we'll go shopping for a Falcon. Okay, so I don't think we need that 030 on there. Let's create that. Right, that'll be £2,500, please. Yeah, prices on those things are ridiculous now. The dummy DSP is default, and I'm not really sure how detailed or good Hatari DSP emulation is. What I do know, however, is that when I was on the Hatari downloads page the other day, there's a beta build of version 2.5 up there. So I guess a full release is just around the corner, and we'll see what that brings. And I'm really, really looking forward to that. 32 megahertz, because we can. And this build, the system that I'm going to run, requires an FPU. It's not that the Falcon requires it, it's just the build. I'm going to give it 10 meg of memory and no TT RAM. ROM-wise, we're going to go with emuTOS. Hard disks, well, we can't use ASCI on a Falcon, so we'll go IDE. So my Mint setup, which is what we're doing, has 2 drives. So let's see how we add the second drive. I made the control act as closely to the Hatari implementation as I could. So you use the arrow button to swap to drive 1 and then select the drive file as usual. So now we have 2 drives. To show you, Mount Fuji supports all 8 devices on ASCI and SCSI, and Obviously 2 devices on IDE. Now we're not going to go with GemDOS because my version of Mint doesn't like them. We'll get to floppies in a minute when we talk about games. I think I've mentioned that before. Since we're going to be rocking Vidal graphics on these machines, we need to select RGB graphics, indicators off, and I'm going to save that, give it a run. While that spins up, why don't you take a second to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already? That would help a lot. Okay, your next boot will go with Mint and Genie. And there's the black scorpion logo for Vidal graphics, and we're on the desktop. And as usual, I'm going to rename this to Mint because I never get the names right first time. Now, games. Let's see how we set up to play a game. Now, I'm going to do this again. I'm just going to give it a random name and we'll see what game we're going to load, then we'll rename it to suit. So my recommended setup for games is a vanilla ST, 8 meg CPU, 512 meg of memory, although some games may require more memory and possibly a blitter. Let's pick a ROM. For games, I always recommend 1.04 for vanilla STs. Not that that's, it's the most compatible, but least buggy. We're not going to have a hard drive or a GemDOS file. What we're going to have is a floppy disk. So let's go find a floppy image. A games folder. That sounds like a good folder to look in. And we're going to pick MISPAC. We need it enabled, and it's a double-sided disk, as normally they are. Let's give the system a sensible name. I'm going to set the screen type to TV. That'll give us scan lines. RGB and VGA also work, and you will get obviously a crisper image. You do you. Now, show borders is a tricky one. I think it's important that they're on for demos, especially the ones that use overscan modes and stuff like that. But for this, I'll probably turn them off. Status bar, definitely off. Frame skip, well, it's going to be off because I've got a powerful machine. So this looks like a good configuration for me. Let's give it a spin. Now that startup screen with the stars, I think, makes it one of Peter Putnick's images from 8bitchip.info. This was a shareware game, I think. It's written in GFA Basic. I'm just going to quit out of that because we've proved our point. When you have lots of systems that are very similar, like say I want to add a second game, well, Miss Pac-Man is already set up for games. So instead of starting with a clean template, what we can do is clone a system. So I clone Ms. Pac-Man and yet again give it a temporary name, so I can't remember what was in that folder. Now as you can see, all of the settings for Ms. Pac-Man were copied over. Screen settings, etc. All I have to do is change the floppy path, and I'm going to pick Treasure Island Dizzy because that's a classic. I'll save the state and run that, but I'm going to speed this up. And at full volume, when I was recording this, I jumped out of my chair when the music started. I think what you can see from this is it should be possible to create a nice little game library using Mount Fuji. We've created some systems, so what else can we do? Now, I mentioned earlier that I had a crap ton of Hatari configs lying around. Well, we can import those. So let's click on the import button and get to doing that. I'm going to call the imported system TT, and let's select a config. Once loaded, it's a TT, Falcon DSP set to dummy, which really should be none, I think, for a TT, but never mind. It's a 68030 running at 32 megahertz. It has a 68882 FPU, 10 meg of RAM, ST-RAM there is, and 32 meg of TT-RAM. The ROM is Emutos. It has a SCSI drive, a random floppy that I'm going to clear because we don't need it. Let's save that and run it. And there we see the massive TT screen. We'll pick NeoDesk, and that is fast. So we have our TT config imported and running. Now, at this point, I wouldn't import files and delete your configs quite yet. There's sections like joysticks and devices aren't handled yet, but let's move the TT image into the correct place. And it crashed. Now I'm back in Mount Fuji, and you can see that dragging it works. So the system list on the left is a MAUI collection view, and it has a couple of known issues. Now this issue is slated for a fix in mid-March 2024. That's MAUI SR3. But we'll have to see. So I'll update any versions as soon as a new version of MAUI comes out, just in case it solves some problems we've got. Now, I could have covered this up with a simple jump cut, right? But I want to be truthful with you. This is early days for this app, and it does crash occasionally. So that's why I save frequently. Before we get to gaps, I'm just going to show you the last couple of things we haven't covered. I'm going to create a system now, and then I'll show you how to delete it, which, is going to be useful. The About dialog shows version information that you might need if you want to raise an issue. It also contains links to the license and my Github repository, where you can raise issues, or you will be able to in the future. More importantly, it has a link to the data directory. So if I click on that, it'll open a file explorer, and here we have the log files. In here, there are also the preference and system definition files. So any future upgrade instructions will most likely recommend running the old version and backing them up first. And finally, we support dark mode. Fuji will use the system theme mode at startup. This button just allows you to toggle to the other one if you want to. And in Windows, by the way, I recommend using light mode for now, as there's a bug in MAUI that styles radio buttons as black on dark grey. It's not a pretty sight. So what's coming up next is a discussion about the gaps and questions I have for you. Now, I'm just going to pop back into light mode. So the next release is going to be a minor update. I want to fix that dark mode on issue on Windows, if I can. Add warn on exit if there's unsafe changes, because I think that would be a good thing to do. I want to upgrade to the next version of MAUI once it comes to see if it fixes that issue in the collection view. And I also want to address any problems that you guys come up with for the first release. After that, each release that I do is going to address a portion of the gaps in the config section and add new features. So let's start by addressing the current major gaps and what new features I'm looking to add in the next full release, shall we say. So I'm going to run Atari and look at its options page. At the moment, Fuji covers all of the options in the first two columns. So that leaves joysticks, keyboards, devices, and to some degree, sound. So we'll start with sound. This is partially complete. The only real question here is the relative importance of the ability to set the file name to record to from Fuji. The actual record button itself will always need to be manually triggered from within Hatari, so it's not difficult to add the file to record to, but it's a question of priority as usual. Now in joysticks, this is where things start to get a little squirrely. While I could create an interface to allow you to set up the joystick key mappings using a real device is kind of tricky. I'm not sure if it's even possible to detect that low level of device using .NET MAUI at the moment, so it may be a thing that I can't do. One thing I could do in the short to medium term is pull the joystick config from a selected Hatari config file that you specify, and then apply that joystick section globally to every saved config that Fuji writes from then on. I don't imagine many people use vastly different joystick configs on a system-by-system basis. So this might be a reasonable solution for now. As usual, feedback would be good. For keyboard, we can actually ultimately implement all of the functionality. It just requires some research and then the time and effort to do it. For creating keyboard mapping files, I'm going to wait until I can create a really good UI for it. I mean, right now I don't even know what keyboard layouts Atari shipped with. I know there was a German keyboard layout. I think there was an Italian, but we have to see. Again, if you think it's worth it in the short to medium terms, I can slurp the keyboard sections out of a specified config and just apply that as a blob like I discussed for joysticks. Now devices here is another part of the config with some easy bits, some difficult bits. So enable printer emulation is just a new piece of UI. In a similar way, the RS-232 emulation is just UI and a bit of config. However, the MIDI emulation is going back into that area of system-specific config and device probing that is just difficult. So depending on how many people want the feature, I can easily add the easy bits and then again possibly slurp the system specific stuff from an existing config file. Okay, shall we have a chat about new features, possible up and coming features, shall we say? So first up, I want to have a re-look at the file and folder picker. Now what I would like to do is turn this path at the top into a clickable breadcrumb to allow you to zap around the file system quicker. In fact, in the installation section for Mac, you kind of see an example of why that would be really useful. Next up is the ROM picker. Now I'd like to move that from a simple file picker to a grid that shows the language, the release date, the file name, and the version. Another thing that would be really good is if anybody can let me know of a source of checksums or hashes for verified ROM dumps, that might allow me to pick up some extra information. So when you create a new system in Fuji, there is a name and a description. The description isn't surfaced yet, but it will be eventually. What I'd like to do here though is add a category. So we could have categories like games, productivity, music, DTP, lots of things. And you would actually create them yourself. So I'm not going to dictate what they are to you. You would just create them. This control here is the system selector, and it's based on the collection view, and it allows you to group entries by things. So I would like to offer you the ability to group them by category or by system type, or having all your STs together, your TTs and your Falcons in groups, or maybe you could group by the first letter of the name, and then you could quickly zap to them. I'd also like to put a filter up there so you can show only specific systems or specific categories. I'd also like to add a search bar up there, because when it comes to games, I think it could be easy to have a list of hundreds in here down the left. And one last thing for now, which is a thing that sort of winds me up in Fuji. At the moment, if you run a game and it requires multiple floppies, when you go to select the second floppy, it kind of dumps you at the root of your device. Then you have to navigate from there, and it's just painful. So one option I'm thinking about is, assuming you keep related floppies for one game in the same folder, is to set the default floppy image path in Hatari to the folder that your first floppy you specify is in. Again, thoughts would be appreciated. So now we're going to cover the installation of Mount Fuji. I'll do macOS first, followed by PC. Please feel free to use the chapter marks below to skip to the one you're interested in, or thanks for watching and I will talk to you soon. Right, installation on a Mac. So here we are on a fresh macOS install on a virtual machine. Now, you will probably already have Hatari installed, but to be sure, for people who don't use Hatari, I'll download that and I'll install it. It's super simple to do. Pop over to the Hatari page and click the download link. And very excitingly, you can see that 2.5 beta branch is being built. So this is good. Let's download the Mac version. Next, we need to download Mount Fuji. So head over to the GitHub page for it. The link is in the description below. Go down there to releases and click on latest version. Now, it certainly will not be 1.0.0 as I recorded this. After that, I released the new version. We have the Mac version of the app, the Windows version, and the source code for you to download for your own perusal. Let's download the Mac version. Okay, I'm going to open Finder and select the Applications folder, and then open another Finder window in my Downloads folder. So we'll install Hatari first. So we open the DMG file and drag Hatari at the Applications folder. Then we drag Mount Fuji into the Applications folder. So before we configure Fuji, let's open Hatari. If you've never used Hatari before, hit the F12 key to open settings. Now we need to know where it's going to save its config files. So let's go to Save Config. And as you can see in my case, it saves its settings in this folder. And the default config is called hatari.cfg. Now, the way Fuji works is to overwrite hatari.config with the systems you are launching. So if you are a seasoned Hatari user, please save your current hatari.config to another file name, as it will be overwritten. Right, that's it for Hatari. Now we run Fuji and set those two paths that were already populated at the start of this video. To run Fuji for the first time, you'll need to tell macOS that you trust it. So right click the app, select Open, then click Open, and in we go. And that should be the last time you see that dialog. Now, we're in the blank state of the app, so let's open our preferences. We'll set the config file first. This display error that shows the selected item black on grey is fixed in the current release. I actually recorded the Apple part of this video before I actually released to GitHub. So it's in Users, David B, Library, Application Support, Hatari. Then select hatari.config. Next, we need to specify where Mount Fuji is, which is all the way up here, and that's why I want a breadcrumb. We go into /applications and select hatari.app. Because an app in macOS is really a folder, we're actually going to go into that folder and then hit OK. And let's check the path at the top ends with hatari.app, which it does. So now we're in the place where we were at the start of this video. You can go and set your folders and get to creating systems. And I hope you enjoy it. Right, PC install. Installing Mount Fuji on Windows is a tickle more complex than macOS, but still pretty simple if you follow these steps. So head over to the GitHub page for Mount Fuji. This is on GitHub, and that link is in the description. Go down there to Releases and click on the latest versions. It may or may not have a larger version number than the one displayed here, but select whatever is shown in the latest release. So here we see the files. There's the Mac version of the app, the Windows version, and the source code for you to download and have a squiz at. Let's download the Windows version. The install process for Windows is in two parts. So the first part is to install and configure a custom version of Hatari. Now, even if you already have Hatari installed on your Windows machine, Fuji will only work with the version it comes with. So extract the archive. Now I'm going to put Hatari into the root of my C drive. You can put it where you like. And in the folder we have a 32-bit and a 64-bit build, and I'm going to use the 64-bit version. So let's start Hatari. On first run you'll get a warning. Click more info, click run anyway, and then the message, you'll never see that again. Ignore the run warning and press F12 to enter Hatari's config and quit. So now Mount Fuji can't currently run executables, so we have to run them in an indirect manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a file with a specific extension, associate our new extension with our custom Hatari executable, and then when Fuji opens that file, that'll actually launch Hatari. Somewhere on your computer, and I would suggest near where Hatari is, create a file called hatari.mfhat. That doesn't look right to me, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the display of file name extensions, because currently this is a text file. Now we remove the .text extension, tell it that we know what we're doing, and then the next step is to associate that extension with Hatari. So right click on the mfhat file, go to Properties, pick an application, More Applications, look for another app on this PC, and we navigate to our custom Hatari exe. So now our extension mfhat is set up to run Hatari. Let's double click on that file and our custom Hatari should launch. Again, ignore that error. Hit F12 to open settings. We're going to need later in this process to know where it's going to save its settings. So we'll go into Save Config again. And as you can see, it saves my settings in this folder. Your machine may vary. And by default, it uses hatari.config as its default config. Let's close this and go back in. And as you can see, it's created hatari.cfg. Now the way Fuji works is to overwrite hatari.cfg with the system you are launching each time you launch a system. So if you're a seasoned Hatari user, save your current hatari.config to another file name as it will be overwritten. You will of course be able to import that into Fuji later. So on to part 2 of installing Fuji. So we go back into the downloads folder and navigate to the Mount Fuji folder. And in here there are a few files including this installer and this certificate. Now we're going to need to install that certificate as a trusted root certificate. Now, by doing this, you're telling Windows to trust anything signed by that certificate, and so you may well decide that you don't want to do that. And if that's the case, unfortunately, you'll have to wait until I get Fuji onto the Windows Store. That could be a long way off as it incurs an annual cost, and it's a cost I might be prepared to pay, but only if enough people use Fuji. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation here. So if you want to install the cert, type cert into the run bar and select Manage Computer Certificates where it shows at the top of the results. Click Yes when prompted. Open Trusted Root Certification. Then right-click on Certificates, select All Tasks, then Import. So navigate to the Downloads folder and locate the certificate in the Mount Fuji folder. Two next buttons and a finish later, that bit's done. Now I would suggest looking down the list and finding the David Black certificate and double clicking it. It should look like this. If it has a red X on the icon, something isn't right and you need to double check the steps you took. The most likely issue is that you didn't install it in Trusted Root Certification, you installed it in another place. If you have problems, contact me through the comments thread. That would be the easiest way. Next, we run the installer by double clicking on the MSIX file. And what I'm going to show you next is what happens if you're on a fairly new machine and you don't have .NET 8 installed. Here, the install pops up a dialog telling you to install the .NET runtime. Click download it now. Now my download didn't start automatically, so I click download manually. That goes into our downloads folder, but I'm actually going to click open up here from the pop-up. The installer is super quick, and once it completes, hit close. Now let's run Fuji, and we need to configure the two preferences that were there at the start of this video. So go to the preferences. We'll start with the config file. So as you can see from Hatari, mine is in C, users, David Black, or your username, app data, local, Hatari. Yours will differ by at least the username. So we'll navigate there and select hatari.cfg. Right, now we set the application. But instead of choosing the Hatari exe, we're going to set it to that mfhat file we created earlier. When you click Run in Fuji, it's going to open that file via the association and open Hatari. So now we're at the place we were at the start of this video, and you can go set up your folders and you can get to creating systems. Sweet.